Chapter 39. October 1913. Guilt plagued Clara as she contemplated leaving her grandparents, but she hoped her absence would be a relief. She couldn't tell them her plans. They wouldn't allow it, of that she was certain. Instead, she would write to them. Twice more she met with Kitty, and Alice agreed to swap her kist for Clara's carpet bag. Each time they met, Clara smuggled a few items out with her, not that she had much to take. Her fine clothes would remain in North Shields, creating a sad bundle as they joined with those Anna had left behind. She still had the clothes she had arrived in, and in these she would leave. With the small allowance given by her grandfather, Clara bought the apron, boots, and warm clothes she would need for an East Anglian winter. Sybil had been keeping a close eye on her and knew something was amiss. Finally, the morning of her departure arrived, and Clara took one last look around her bedroom. She planned to leave a note on her bed, but had second thoughts. She didn't trust Sybil to pass it on. Slipping quietly from her room, Clara crept down the stairs, made easier by the plush carpet, and, finding her grandmother's book, slipped the note inside. She gathered her bag and coat and made for the front door. As she turned the handle, her grandmother appeared at the top of the stairs. "Is that you, Clara?" she said in a voice that sounded timid and frail. "Aye," said Clara, forgetting herself. "Sorry, yes." "Are you going?" Something in the way she said it made Clara stop short. She looked up at her grandmother. There was no need to pretend. They couldn't stop her now. "Yes, grandmother, I'm going. I'll be away for a while, but I promise I'll write. Thank you for everything you have done for me." "Will you be safe?" Clara dropped her bag and took the stairs 2 at a time. She lifted Phyllis's thin, papery hands in her own. "I'll be safe. I'm going away with some good female friends. One day I hope to return to the island. It isn't what you want to hear, but your daughter loved it there as much as I did. She was happy, oh so happy, and above all, she was the most wonderful mam I could have wished for." Phyllis gave a small choke. "I loved her," she said, tears weaving their way down the crevices of her aging skin. "I know," said Clara. She bent and kissed Phyllis's cheek. "I'll write," she promised, and with that she ran down the stairs and let herself out of the door. Grief eclipsed the excitement of leaving. She would keep her promise and write. But would she ever see her grandparents again? It seemed unlikely. Kitty was waiting for Clara at the end of the road. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, holding her palms to Clara's cheeks and staring hard into her eyes. "Aye, I'm sure," said Clara. Hand in hand, they walked towards the harbour. Kists lay in ramshackle piles beside a cart, ready to take to the station. The atmosphere was bittersweet. Excitement brimmed at their new adventure, but leaving friends and loves behind tinged it with regret. Alice waved them off and wished Clara well. They squeezed themselves into the cart. A hard-edged kist prodded Clara's back, and only a sliver of Kitty's flaming hair poked above the luggage. At the station, they uncurled their stiff limbs, and the driver helped them load their kists onto the train. The platform was brimming with herring girls. They might have been in the Highlands, for it was Scots and Gaelic chatter that bounced off the station walls. A whistle shrieked, and they jumped aboard the train. In their third-class carriage, they didn't notice the hardness of the seats or the freezing air whistling through gaps in the walls. With a sly smile, Kitty reached into her bag and pulled out a bottle of gin. She passed it round, each girl taking a slug from the bottle. Hours flew past, girls singing merrily as the train rattled their bones like shells in a bag. They taught Clara the songs of their homeland, and by the end of the journey she knew them by heart. The train crept into Lowestoft station with a squealing of metal and a hissing of smoke. After the long journey, the girls were black with soot, but their spirits remained high. They unloaded their kists onto a cart and jumped on the back. Kitty yelled directions to the driver, and they made their way to their lodgings. "We're heading for the grit, girls," she cried. Lowestoft buzzed with life, and its drifters were packed in so tight you could walk from one side of the harbour to the other without touching a drop of sea. Men in Ganseys and sou'westers streamed around the dock. The air was alive with cries and laughter of both men and girls. Their lodgings were in a house on Rantscore East, belonging to a Mrs. Creek, a most unwelcoming host. She held her nose, complaining of the bad smells the girls brought with them. They unloaded their kists from the cart and heaved them up the bare wooden staircase. Kitty kicked open the door of their room and held it open with her foot as her roommate stumbled in under the weight of their kists. The room was bare, other than 3 sets of rickety bunks, 1 chair and a small dresser. Hooks were nailed into the walls to hang their oilskin aprons, and their clothes remained stored in the kists that doubled as seating. The girls scrambled to choose their bunks, taking Clara by surprise. She ended up with the only bunk left. A rosy-cheeked middle-aged woman called Heather lay on the bunk above. Clara noticed the other girls giggling, descending into snorts of laughter. "Bad luck, Clara," said Cassie, patting Clara on the arm before bursting into another fit of giggles. "What?" Kitty tried to speak, but with each attempt she began spluttering. "You drew the short straw," explained a thin young girl, and she pointed up to Heather, her features twisting with mirth. "It's all lies, Clara. Don't believe a word they tell you about me," said Heather with a wink. When they had calmed down, Kitty explained that not only was Heather a terrible snorer, but the herring did strange things to her bowels. "Your bunk will tremble through the night, that's for sure." The giggling resumed. Clara couldn't imagine any amount of snoring would keep her awake after a day's work. At least, she hoped it wouldn't. She threw herself down on her bed, the effects of the lengthy journey clear in her tired limbs. But Kitty was having none of it. "No time for sleeping, lassie. We need to look around, see the sights," she winked at Cassie, who giggled at the prospect of eyeing up a few fishing lads. Clara wanted to protest, but excitement got the better of her. She picked up a shawl and moved to the door, noticing the other girls stuffing balls of yarn into their pockets. "I thought we were going for a walk." "Aye, we are, but you'll soon see we are never idle," said Kitty, handing Clara a spare ball of yarn and a pair of needles. The girls headed out of the house in a raucous cloud of chatter. Mrs. Creek huffed as they passed. Out on the street, the girls picked up their needles, knitting as they walked. Unused to such multitasking, several times Clara bumped into lamp-posts and carts as she stole glances to check her stitches. Watery daylight slipped into solid darkness. The streets were full of life, despite the gloom and biting October air. Had she come to Lowestoft directly from the island, the stench of rotting guts, shouts, cries and songs of the fishermen would have been overwhelming. With so many bodies around, it was hard to walk in a straight line, never mind while knitting at the same time. "You all right?" asked Kitty. "Aye, I am." "Good," said Kitty. "You're about to have the best 3 months of your life." The Grit. Chapter 40. September 1913. The Grit was the place to be, and 1913 was the year to be there. "What's the Grit?" asked Jimmy, as Graham led his crew away from the harbour. "It's where we'll be living for the next while," said Graham. "Paradise," said Callum, and the crew laughed. They walked some more before Graham turned to Jimmy and, spreading his arms wide, announced, "The Grit." In front of them stood a grand church. "Christ Church, the Fisherman's Church," said Graham. Despite the cold, a group of children were gathered in the church square. Huddled together on their haunches, some played marbles, while others were whipping round a skipping rope, jumping at the speed of lightning. "That'll keep them warm," said Jimmy. "Reckon they'll let us join in?" asked Callum, running towards the children. He jumped into the middle of the rope. It caught around his ankles, pulling children down with him as he tumbled to the floor. "Away with you!" called Graham. "The rest of us are freezing to death here." "Just having a little fun, Skipper," said Callum as he rubbed a grazed elbow. Beyond the church lay rows and rows of terraces cut with steep staircases that Jimmy was told were the scores. A pub graced every street. "More pubs per head than anywhere in the world," said Callum. This place would be heaven for Alex, thought Jimmy. The Grit was a town within a town. Jimmy had seen nothing of Lowestoft, but wondered why anyone would venture beyond the cliff when everything you could need was here. A mile long and half a mile wide, the Grit had shops of every kind. Butchers, chemists, sweet shops, bakers, toy shops. There were laundries, factories, net stores, fish houses and pickling yards. Girls in oilskin aprons wandered around knitting as they walked. Grubby children tore in and out of unlocked front doors. Women were out in their yards, hanging washing on lines, and men were heading to the pubs. "We're up here," said Graham, leading his crew along the dubiously named Anguish Street. Jimmy hoped the name wasn't an omen. Before they reached it, the door was flung open and a ruddy, middle-aged woman rushed out to embrace Graham. "Good to see you, Josie," he said, kissing the woman's cheek. "Likewise. Looks like you've got a young'un with you this year," she said. "Aye, this is Jimmy." "Welcome to my humble abode," she laughed, shaking Jimmy's hand. "Now, let me look at the rest of you. Callum, I think you've grown even taller, and Martin's cheery as ever, I see." She greeted the rest of the crew, even Martin, with warmth and humour. "Settle yourselves in, and I'll bring you up a cuppa shortly." "Come on, lads, let's do as we're told," said Graham, winking at Josie. The cottage was tiny, a 2 up, 2 down, with a staircase in the middle. "Privy's out in the yard," said Graham as he took the stairs 2 at a time. Their room was bare, other than a small chest of drawers and a pile of blankets in one corner. "There are your beds," said Graham, picking up a blanket and laying it out by the window. "Not exactly luxury, but the herring will have us away on the chase most of the time." Josie appeared with a tray of steaming mugs. "How do you like the beach?" she asked Jimmy. "Oh, I've only seen it from the water." Josie looked confused, and Graham jumped in to explain. "This is the beach, Jimmy, or the beach village, or the Grit. They're all the same thing." "Oh, I see. I'm used to a place with more than one name." "Where are you from, lad?" asked Josie. "Holy Island, but its old name is Lindisfarne, and some people still call it that." "An island, hey? Bet that's a nice place to live. Do they have pubs, though?" "Aye," laughed Jimmy. "Plenty of pubs." "Good," said Josie, setting down the tray in the middle of the room. "You out on the boat tomorrow?" "Aye," said Graham. "I'd like to be out tonight, but thought the lads deserved an evening off." "Ah, you're a kind skipper, Graham. I hope these lads appreciate you. There's talk around the village this will be a bumper year. Enjoy your night off, lads, 'cause it might be the last you get in a while." The men thanked their host and sipped the hot tea. "You hear that, lads? A bumper year. Let's hope the Silver Darlings are ready for us." Graham clinked his mug against the others. "I reckon it's time for something stronger," said Callum. "All right, lads, but not too much. I want you at your best when we head out tomorrow." "Aye, skipper," they all agreed. Despite the number of men at sea, the rising sun had a quiet busyness to it. Old boys sat playing dominoes, men propped up the bar, and only 2 tables were free. "I'll get these. What are ye having?" The crew gave Jimmy their orders, and he headed to the bar. "Not seen you in here before. You after the herring?" asked the publican. "Aye, arrived today." "Crabbin' Mike," said the man, holding out a hand. "Jimmy." "Looks like it'll be a good season. Plenty of crans coming into the harbour already." "That's grand," said Jimmy. Back at the table, he passed on the news to his crew. "Like Josie said." "Aye. Do you think they're right?" asked Jimmy. "I do," said Graham. "These are true fishing folk. They know the signs. If they say there are plenty of silver darlings, there are plenty of silver darlings." "I'll drink to that," said Samuel. 3 pints in, Callum turned to Martin. "You going to play us a tune, lad?" Martin scowled. "Oh, come on, lad. Don't hide your light under a bushel." The men laughed. "Can ye play?" asked Jimmy. "Aye, but I try not to," said Martin. "There'll be a pint waiting if you do," coaxed Graham. This did the trick, and Martin slunk across the room to the piano. "When did he learn to play?" "His mam sent him for lessons. Wanted him to be a cut above the other lads. Explains the enormous chip on his shoulder," said Graham. Everyone laughed. "Every pub here has a piano," said Callum. "Saved from a wreck years back. Martin hates it. Can't escape the damn things he says." The piano struck up, drowning out their laughter. Jimmy looked on, amazed. His dour crewmate sat by the piano, eyes closed, face animated. "For someone who hates playing, he sure seems to enjoy himself." "Aye," said Graham. "He loves it really." With a pianist in their midst, the crew were a hit with the locals, and it was a merry evening. They would look back on the night fondly, for the locals' predictions were right. They would barely see the grit over the next few weeks, for the silver darlings had arrived. Sea and silvery scales would fill every waking hour. Chapter 41. October 1913. The 12th of October, 1913, was a day Jimmy would never forget. On the evening of the 11th, they set off from the harbour, along with hundreds of other boats. Frustration creased Graham's face as they trailed behind the new steam drifters. But there was a good wind, and they were not far behind. Like many vessels, their destination was Smith's Knoll, around 30 miles out. As they approached, they saw a mass of gulls circling, and in the fading light, the water below turned silvery green. "Looks like a good night," said Graham. They shot over 2 miles of nets and settled down for scran and sleep. Boats were bobbing on the water as far as the eye could see, the red-brown sails acting as flags to show they were all after herring. "I hope there is enough to go round," complained Martin. "Well, there is enough for the gulls, so I'd say there's a good chance there is enough for us," said Graham. Graham was right. Far from too little, the nets were full to bursting. "Hurry, lads, we have to beat the steamers. I need you to work harder than you've done in your life," said Graham. They hauled and hauled, muscles straining, sweat pouring, until herring spilled from the hold and across the deck. "Any more fish and the boat will sink. Throw the rest back, lads," said Graham. They didn't like to see money slipping down beneath the waves, but speed was of the essence. If they didn't leave soon, the other boats would be in first and the price would drop. They hoisted the sails and headed for land. Some steam drifters were ahead of them, but they had worked hard and were in the middle of the pack. "Next year I'm saving myself the worry and getting a boat with steam," said Graham as Ness Point came into view. By the time they arrived, the harbour was already a hive of activity. Quarter-crans covered the ground, with more swung on to the quayside every minute. Merchants and salesmen eyed the catches, checking for quality and price. With such a large catch, the unloading was a long job. It was several hours before the fish were aboard the cart and headed for the yards. "I'll meet you at the Rising Sun," said Graham, heading off to the fish market. The crew were through their second pint by the time Graham joined them. He walked into the middle of the room and shouted, 10 million fish! 10 million fish, they reckon, was brought in today." Cheers erupted through the room. "Get a good price, skipper?" asked Samuel. "Not bad. A good thing we weren't the last in, though, for the price had dropped right down by the time I left." "To the Stargazer," said Callum, clinking glasses with his crewmates. "I'll get around in," said Graham. He appeared back with a tray of whiskies. "To Lowestoft," he said, and glasses clinked once more. "Dearest Clara, I've been checking at the post office when I can, but still no news from you or the island. I can't pretend I'm not disappointed. Then again, perhaps you've been busy, or found yourself a new fellow. Well, I'll share my news. We reached Lowestoft some weeks back, and it's quite the place, I can tell you. I reckon you could fit 20 of Holy Island in the town. I'm living on the Grit, a village beneath the cliff where the main town sits. It's hard to tell where the Grit ends and the fishing begins, for it stretches right to the water, and everyone here is in with the fishing. There's a place called the Dens, where the beasters work, on the nets, but nets are everywhere, strung up on every pole and hook that's spare. The Gritsters seem to welcome us fishing folk from the north, and though they have little in the way of coins, they're a colourful bunch, full of warmth and mirth. Many a local man has married a Scots lass. And the Gritsters are a peculiar mix of north and south. They're a tough breed, that's for sure. Never have I met such hard-working folk. We've had our work cut out since we arrived. The silver darlings must have a fondness for the place, for the sea all around turns silver by night, and you've never seen so many crans of herring come onto shore by morning. There's talk 10 million herring were landed in just one day. How they counted them I can't say, but I've seen with my own eyes the mountains of fish, and can well believe it true. We've barely set foot on land, and when we do, it's to sleep and nothing more. There was one night when we went to see a show at the Palladium. That was quite something, and there's always time for a pint in the rising sun, but mostly it's just sleeping. Where Callum gets his rest from I can't say, for while we are dozing, he's often out chasing the herring lassies. The chase of the herring is enough for me. Graham is talking of getting himself a steam drifter next season. I wouldn't mind being on the crew when he does, for they fly through the water faster than the darlings themselves. You might grow tired of all this talk of fish, so that's all for now. If you have time to respond, it would be welcome. I miss you, Clara, and would love to hear how Marnie and the bairns are doing. All for now. Jimmy. Chapter 42. November 1913. Jimmy refused the coaxing of his crewmates to go to the dance. It had been a long week, and he could barely lift his arms, never mind hold a lassie. He would put up with the lads ribbing for the chance of a few hours by himself. "Think of the lasses that will be there, Jim," said Callum. "Tonight might be the night you meet the girls of your dreams." "Go on with you. Keep talking to me and you'll miss your chance with the herring girls." Callum looked alarmed and headed for the door. "All right. Just don't blame me if you end up a lonely old man with just a book for company." Graham shooed the men from the room. Once in a comfortable position, Jimmy pulled a copy of Middlemarch from his bag. He had read every book he owned several times and wished he had brought more with him. He could recite the poems of Robert Burns by heart and longed for new reading material. But Callum's jibes had left him unsettled. That there would ever be anyone but Clara had never crossed his mind, but she had refused him. Frustrated and growing weary of the book, he packed it away and crossed the room. At the mirror, he checked his appearance and tried to smooth down wayward curls. If he ran fast enough, he could catch the lads. Sure enough, they were in striking distance, and as he reached them, panting, they turned in surprise. "Look who's here!" cried Callum. "Couldn't resist the lassies, huh?" Actually, the prospect of reading Middlemarch for a 5th time was worse than an evening with ye. "Well, I've no clue what you're going on about, but I'm pleased you're here," said Callum, slinging an arm across Jimmy's shoulder. Rather than go straight to the dance, they called in a pub filled with fishing crews. Several groups must have been there a while, for the noise inside was deafening, and men swayed unsteadily, covering the floor with splashes of amber liquid. With all seats taken, Jimmy and the crew huddled in the centre of the room. He regretted his decision to come, for the inebriated men reminded him of Alex and were all too familiar. A bear of a man stumbled back from the bar, knocking into their group and sending beer raining through the air. "Watch it," snarled Martin. "What did you say?" said the man bear, spinning round to face them. "I said, watch it." Graham laid a steadying hand on Martin's arm. With a vile gurgling sound, The man sucked phlegm up from the depths of his lungs. He paused a moment before depositing it on Martin's boot. Nervous laughter rippled through the room, and the man turned back to his pint. Martin lurched forward, but Callum held him back. "It's not worth the trouble, Martin. Leave it." All the crew felt uneasy, but Martin seemed ready to comply and stood scowling as Callum tried to keep the conversation going. Then, without warning, Martin turned and tapped the man bare on the shoulder. As they faced each other, Martin flung his head back, whipping it forward with an almighty crack. He caught the man on the nose. Blood poured from it, and as it soaked his shirt, a murderous look entered his eyes. Within seconds, a full-blown fight had broken out, fists flying indiscriminately. They knocked over tables and glasses splintered, the frantic landlady screaming at the men to get out. Jimmy found himself dragged across the room by Callum's forceful grip. They emerged onto the street, followed by a glass that missed their heads by an inch. Both had escaped unharmed and moved to the safety of a shop doorway to wait. "Should we go back in and help?" asked Jimmy. "No, best wait it out here. They'll be all right. Should be out soon." "Middlemarch seems suddenly appealing," said Jimmy. Callum laughed, unfazed by the situation. The doors of the bar opened and Martin emerged, held up by Graham and Samuel on either side. He pushed them away, but when they let go, his legs buckled and he fell to the floor. "There won't be any dancing for this one tonight," said Graham, and Martin scowled. "I'm taking him home." "Want us to come?" asked Callum. "No, we'll be right. I don't want you to miss out on seeing your admirers. Ta, skipper." Callum helped Jimmy to his feet, and the crew made their way to the hall. Jimmy wasn't sure he had ever seen so many people in one place. The hall was a mass of bodies, some gyrating to the music, others talking in groups, couples finding a moment of passion in not-so-quiet corners. "Drink?" shouted Callum above the din. Jimmy nodded. The rest of the crew dispersed among the crowd, but Jimmy stood still, waiting for Callum to return. Uncomfortable among so many strangers, he wished he had persevered with his book. Callum didn't return, and Jimmy looked for him at the bar. It was lucky Callum was tall, or Jimmy would never have noticed him among the group of women. "Excuse me," he said, but no one let him through. "Excuse me." Callum was regaling the enthralled women with a tale of the sea. A young girl pressed herself close to the giant Scot. Jimmy stood on tiptoes and reached above the women's heads, tapping Callum on the shoulder. "Ah, Jimmy, sorry, I got distracted. Here's your drink." "Thanks," said Jimmy, pushing through the throng. "Girls, meet my friend Jimmy. He's been lonely since we arrived." Jimmy met Callum's wink with a scowl. Callum grinned and slipped his arm round a girl's waist. She giggled and perched herself on his lap. Jimmy shuffled as hungry eyes looked him up and down. "I'd love to have his hair," remarked a thin girl who couldn't be much older than 16. "I'd love to have his eyes," said another. "I'd love to have him," shouted a plump, middle-aged woman, and laughter erupted. Someone's fingers pinched his bottom hard, and Jimmy jumped, turning puce and looking round for the culprit. This prompted more laughter, and once again he wished he had stayed at home. On balance, Jimmy was the more attractive of the two, but his awkwardness left him overshadowed by the manly confidence oozing from Callum. He was an easy target for the girls. They loved a joke at a man's expense, and Jimmy's blushes gave them a suitable reward. The Herring girls were an altogether different breed. Independent and sure of themselves, they would take no nonsense from any man. Here it was a woman's world. Jimmy would need to draw on his experience of 8 sisters to help him better understand the fairer sex. "Let's dance," someone called, and the gaggle of Herring girls pulled Callum into the throng. Jimmy remained at the bar, grateful for a moment of solitude. He surveyed the scene before him. Young men strutting about thinking they were the bee's knees, when anyone with half a brain could see it was the lasses in control. His eyes scanned the room, settling on 2 girls deep in conversation. One had her back turned, but there was a familiarity to her movements. Jimmy's glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. "Clara," Fragments of glass scattered in all directions, but no one noticed above the hum of music and voices. Jimmy couldn't catch his breath. His heart pounded in his ears, and he steadied his weak body against the bar. What was she doing here? Before Jimmy could decide what to do, a man with a child's face approached Clara. He led her to the dance floor, and Jimmy watched as she spun round in his arms. Her hair glistened under the hall lights. Her face beamed. She was happy. Jimmy hated the man with his arms around Clara's narrow waist, face pressed close, whispering sweet nothings in her ear. At that moment, he hated Clara too. Hadn't she told him she would never leave the island? Yet here she was, dancing without a care in the world. Jimmy ordered a dram of whiskey and downed it in one gulp. He turned back to the dance floor, but Clara had gone. Without saying goodbye to Callum, Jimmy slipped out of the back door. The whiskey had gone to his head, and he stumbled his way round the side of the building. Rounding the corner, he saw Clara sitting on a bench. He stayed in the shadows unobserved. They were too far away for him to hear their conversation, but Clara was smiling. Jimmy felt sick. The pair stood, and he watched as they slipped away into the dark night. Sucking in deep lungfuls of sea air, Jimmy waited for his head to clear. He sunk down against the wall and tried to process what he had seen. Clara, in Lowestoft. His Clara. Only she seemed older somehow, and she wasn't his anymore. She hadn't even told him where she was. Did she care so little for him? Anger bubbled inside him, and instead of returning home, he went back inside the hall. At the bar, he ordered a whiskey, then another, then another. By the time Callum appeared with 2 girls in tow, Jimmy was swaying, slurring about some girl called Clara to whoever would listen. "Looks like your friend has had a bit too much," laughed one of Callum's companions. Callum looked worried. He had never seen Jimmy drunk or out of control. "You're right there." Jimmy slung unintelligible words at Callum and lurched towards the dance floor. Bodies parted as he lunged back and forth, girls screeching as he stepped on their toes. A woman approached and took him in a firm grip. Jimmy couldn't see her out-of-focus form, but knew she was plump and older than most in the room. "Come on, lad. Let's get some air." The woman guided Jimmy outside towards the beach. He staggered a few steps forward, but the cold air hit him hard. He bent over, retching up mouthfuls of bile-flavoured whiskey. "Here, wash your mouth out with this." Jimmy took a sip from her hip flask and forced the bitter liquid down his throat. He stumbled down the beach and splashed his face with freezing seawater. Feeling better, he thanked the woman for her kindness. "Where you heading, lad?" "The Grit." "Me too. Let's walk together." The woman linked her arm in his, and they trod across the beach, scuffing up fine sand as they went. "Right, I'm off this way," she said, pointing towards Lighthouse Score. She held him in a tight embrace, and Jimmy sank into the warmth of human contact. She moved to let go, but Jimmy clung on. The woman's manner shifted, and she began running her hands through his hair. Jimmy's own hands ran up and down her back. He felt a stirring inside him, at odds with the aging unattractiveness of the woman he held. Her breathing grew heavy as she tugged at his hair. "You want it, do you?" she whispered, menace in her voice. "No," thought Jimmy. "I don't want it. I don't want her." But his body disobeyed his mind, and he pressed hard against her in reply. All his anger at Clara was pouring out, sending him down a path of self-destruction from which he couldn't free himself. She kissed him hard. Her mouth was slippery and left his face sticky. She pulled him behind the fishermen's sheds. "You done this before?" "No. I'll show you the ropes." Jimmy wanted to stop but didn't know how. She reached down, unfastening his trousers and taking him in her hand. Skirt pulled up, she guided him to where he should be. Tears ran down his cheeks as he gave himself to her. He finished with a shudder. She straightened her skirt. "Not bad," she said, before heading off across the beach. Jimmy stood in a daze. He walked down to the water's edge. The cold didn't touch him as he removed his clothes, folding them in a pile on the sand. It was only when he stepped into the water that the temperature had an effect, tearing through him till it reached his bones. He sat cross-legged in the waves, enduring the pain of the water as a fitting punishment for his actions. Perhaps, he thought, he was his father's son after all. Chapter 43. November 1913. Callum looked across at Jimmy. 2 weeks had passed since the night of the dance, and still his friend was no less tetchy or withdrawn. Any spare moments they had, Jimmy's nose was in a book, and Callum hadn't even got him across the threshold of the rising sun. He could count on one hand the words Jimmy had spoken since that evening. Rumours swirled among the herring girls, but they were so out of character for his friend, Callum struggled to believe them. When asked, Jimmy would neither confirm nor deny their authenticity, so Callum gave up trying. All that could raise a smile from Jimmy were the pages of a novel. Callum left him to it. Jimmy's demeanour hadn't gone unnoticed by his skipper, but Graham had little time to worry, for the silver darlings kept coming. Besides, Jimmy hauled as hard as ever and seemed to salve his frustrations at sea, working twice as hard as other men. Graham was satisfied that out among the crashing waves, Jimmy would work out whatever was troubling him. "Where are you spending Christmas, Jim?" Jimmy shrugged and continued to read. If his actions at the dance had taught him anything, it was to keep as much distance between him and Alex as possible. Stay too close, and his dad's poison could swirl around him like the island mists, settling on his skin before making its way to his heart. "Jimmy?" Head in his book, Jimmy ignored his friend. Callum reached down and yanked the book from his hands. "Whatever happened that night, whatever you did, it was down to you. Stop taking it out on the rest of us. Bloody hell, Jim, we've been tiptoeing around you for weeks. Get your head out of your own ass and stop being such a pain in ours." The crew held their breath. Jimmy stared at Callum. Then for the first time in weeks, he smiled. "Sorry," he said. "Apology accepted." "Have I really been that bad?" "Worse. Your eyes are more doleful than the bloody herring." Jimmy laughed, and Callum pulled him to his feet and gripped him in a bear hug. "Why don't you spend Christmas with me?" he said. "You sure? What about your mum?" Callum laughed. "If I bring you home, Mum will think I'm on the straight and narrow at last. You're a middle-aged woman's dream, Jim." Jimmy winced at his choice of words, and Callum wondered if the rumours were true. "So, what do you think?" "If you're sure your Mum won't mind, then I'd love to." On their last night in Lowestoft, they headed out in search of a party, even Jimmy agreeing to one final celebration. The price of the herring had dropped, but what a sight it was to see the crans mounting up on the quay. It was hard to find space in a pub, with every crew out in force. Singing filled the air, and it wasn't long before Jimmy had a pint pressed into his hand. Despite his promise to himself that he would never be drunk again, the celebrations continued long into the night, and Jimmy soon lost count of how many pints he had sunk. The party spilled out onto the high street, groups of lads mingling with groups of lasses in the hope of one last hurrah. "Jimmy! Jimmy, come here!" Callum waved from across the street. He was standing with women Jimmy had not met before. "Come on," said Callum, pulling him over to the group. "Meet Kitty. She's tipsy and not making much sense, but she knows someone from your island." Jimmy turned cold, but it wasn't from the November chill. "Kitty, this is my friend I was telling you about. Jimmy." A girl with wild red hair was holding out a hand, and Jimmy shook it. The girl eyed Jimmy. "I've seen you before." "Oh?" "Aye, back on the island. I saw you in the yard. You were Clara's fella." All colour drained from Jimmy's face. "How is Clara?" Kitty was shrewd enough to realise she had put her foot in it. "Oh, aye, she's grand. Won't stop talking about the island, though." She looked nervous. "Is she going back soon?" No. Now Kitty looked very uncomfortable, but Jimmy probed further. "She told me she'd never leave. Why's she not going back? Has she met a fella?" Like a caged animal, Kitty looked for an escape, but finding none, she faced his question head-on. Jimmy turned on his heel and strode down the street. He heard both Callum and Kitty calling after him, but didn't turn back. A safe distance away, a wave of nausea rushed through him, and he darted down an alley to vomit behind a pile of boxes. He emerged, wiping his mouth, to raucous laughter and jibes from a passing group of fishermen. The streets were heaving, and finding his way through with a mind addled by drink proved tricky. A large group of men were walking towards him, and Jimmy stepped into the road to avoid them. The whinnying of a horse pierced the air, and Jimmy turned to see a barrel-laden cart hurtling towards him. The last thing he remembered was a disgusting cracking sound. Then the world went black. Chapter 44. December 1913. A bright light pierced his eyes as Jimmy peeled his lids apart. His room was noisy, but not with the gruff Scots voices he was used to. He could hear squeaking wheels in need of oiling, and a jangling of metal and glass. Footsteps clacked against a smooth floor, and voices mingled together in a hum of East Anglian drawl. He tried to sit up and get his bearings, but pain ripped through his limbs, and he laid his pounding head back down. His lips were dry with a terrible thirst. He reached for the chipped cup he kept beside his bed, but his fingers clutched at thin air. "Graham," he said, but only a croak came out. He tried again. "Graham." This time a whisper escaped his lips. He felt a small hand gripping his, then an urgent call. "Nurse! Nurse!" Jimmy smiled, certain the voice was Marnie's. He closed his eyes to slip back into his dream. The next time he woke, it was dark, other than a small light in the corner of his eye. Again, he tried to sit. Again, he slumped back down. Panic rose in him. Something heavy was pressing on his stomach, and he reached to push it away. The object lifted with a sudden movement that startled him. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw a figure leaning in towards him. His breath was fast, and his heart raced. A whimpering came from his mouth that he seemed unable to stop. As a light dazzled him, the monster at his bedside became an angel, bright blonde curls glowing in the lamplight. Jimmy rubbed his eyes and stared hard at the angel above him. "Jimmy," said the angel. "Marnie?" "Aye," said Marnie and squeezed his hand. "Am I dreaming? Am I dead?" "No, my love, you're not dreaming, nor dead." She ran her hand across his forehead, marred by congealed blood around a still weeping wound. Her hand ran up to his curls and swept over a stubbly patch of skin held together by tiny stitches. "Where am I?" "You had an accident. You're in the hospital. It's late now. Try to sleep and we can talk in the morning." Questions rushed through Jimmy's mind, but the effort of thinking tired him more. However hard he fought, sleep proved a potent adversary, overwhelming him. A fresh breeze scuffed Jimmy's closed eyes, causing them to flicker towards the morning light. He remembered dreaming of an angel. Disorientated, he lifted his head a few inches. In a chair beside him lay his sister, curled in a ball, golden hair spilling across her face in a messy halo. 8 neat beds lay side by side, some empty, some with curtains drawn. An austere nurse emerged from behind a curtain, surprised to find Jimmy's wary eyes upon her. "You're awake, I see. About time." She glared at Jimmy as if she had caught him sleeping on a job. "Get some more rest," she contradicted. "I'll be back on my rounds shortly." The voice of the nurse intruded on Marnie's sleep, and she stirred, uncurling herself from her cat-like pose and brushing curls from her eyes. "Morning, sleeping-head," she said. "Where am I?" "In hospital. Don't you remember? I told you last night." No, I mean, where am I? What place is this? Marnie looked confused. You're in a hospital in Lowestoft. You had an accident, Jimmy, and they brought you here. But, why are you here? How did you get here so quick? Marnie threw back her head and let out a hearty laugh. How long do you think you've been here, Jimmy? She asked, laughter dancing in her eyes. Since last night, he said, irked that she found his predicament amusing. Marnie moved over to the bed and sat beside Jimmy. Jim, you've been here 2 weeks, she said, the laughter disappearing as quickly as it had come. We thought you may never wake. She reached across and clasped his hand in her own. Jimmy lay staring at the peeling paint of the ceiling, confusion addling his mind. He tried to lift his head again to look at his sister, but the effort was too great. I don't know why I'm here, he whispered. As Marnie explained about the accident with the horse and cart, fragments of memory flickered across Jimmy's mind. Fear and confusion crossed his face. Where's the crew? I'm supposed to be with Callum for Christmas. Marnie squeezed his hand. The crew waited long enough for me to arrive, then they had to go back up north. Callum wanted to stay longer but couldn't risk delaying their voyage. They were here with you day and night, Jimmy. It was them that told the hospital where you came from. They sent word to the island, and I caught the first train I could. Jimmy turned his head away so that Marnie couldn't see the tears in his eyes. When you're well enough, I'll take you home and care for you till you're back on your feet. Jimmy felt the whitewashed walls of the hospital room closing in on him, breath being sucked from his lungs. Would his escape amount to only 8 short months? Not even a year? Oh, how Alex would enjoy the sight of his crippled son returning with his tail between his legs. His hands balled into fists, and he kept his head turned from Marnie. What's wrong with me? He asked through clenched teeth. Jimmy, you've broken near enough every bone in your body. The doctors say most are healing nicely, but your left leg isn't looking too great just now. At any rate, it will be months before you're fully back on your feet, so to speak. I need to sleep, he said with a coldness he regretted, for none of this was Marnie's fault. Hatred boiled in his veins, not for Marnie, but himself. He had escaped the island to get away from his dad, but by drinking himself stupid, hadn't he behaved just like him? Again. Maybe distance was no rescue from destiny. Chapter 45. December 1913. In the week since he woke, Jimmy had barely uttered a word, even to the sister he adored. He could cope with the physical pain of his broken body, but his heart was heavy, and there seemed no way out. From beyond his window, he saw a small wedding party making their way down the street. They were too far off for him to see well, but the bride reminded him of Clara. He remembered Kitty's words and hated himself for the fool he had been. He had sacrificed his love for freedom, and now he had lost both. The nurses gave him short shrift, considering his glum attitude at odds with everything they knew men to be. Marnie's frequent visits just tied his noose tighter, and he met her kindness with a sullen demeanour. Only an elderly, plump nurse named Marjorie lifted him from his desperation. She threw open the curtains, letting the view and light flood in, propped winter greenery in a vase beside his bed, and offered homemade cakes that even in his self-pity he was polite enough to accept. One morning, after completing her rounds, she approached his bedside, a thick brown paper package in her hands. Jimmy kept his eyes lowered, but she continued to stand, holding out the package in front of her. Well, aren't you going to ask what I have here? No, Marjorie, I'm not. Marjorie humphed and sat her plump backside down on the bed. She undid the string that held the paper tight. What do we have here? She teased, unfolding the brown paper. Jimmy looked away, but curiosity got the better of him, as he heard the familiar thwap of pages being thumbed. His movement was returning, and he propped himself up against his pillows. "Oh, so you are interested, are you?" asked Marjorie, holding the paper package behind her back. "Come on, Marjorie. You've got me sitting up. What more do you want?" Marjorie handed him the package, and Jimmy began pulling out book after book after book. "Where did you get these?" "Your friends left them for you." "What friends?" "The friends that stunk of fish. George, I think they called the ringleader." "Graham." Jimmy stroked each cover and flicked through the books. He lifted his head. "When did they leave them?" "A couple of days after you arrived. Said they had to go and you might need some company." Marjorie smiled. "Matron said you weren't to have them yet. Thought they'd tire you out. But I reckon they're just what the doctor ordered." She winked at Jimmy and moved off to attend to her duties. Jimmy was lying on his side when Marnie walked in. Tiptoeing to his bed, she realised he wasn't asleep, but reading. She coughed to make him aware of her presence, but he didn't look up. She coughed again, and this time he looked up at her, surprised. "Sorry, Marnie, I was miles away." Her heart filled as he smiled at her for the first time in a week. "What you reading?" Jimmy held up his book. "What is it?" He looked at her. "Marnie, can you read yet?" Marnie flushed. "We didn't all get the chance of school," she said, plonking herself down in a chair. "Would you like me to teach you?" Her face lit up, eyes full of hope. "Would you?" "There's not much else for me to do in here, is there?" he smiled. "Next time you come, bring paper and a pencil." Jimmy shifted himself so he was sitting. Moving was still painful. He had broken his right arm, and doing everything with the left was troublesome, but he was learning to cope. He stung with humiliation every time the nurses came to help with toileting, and was determined to be back on his feet as soon as possible. "Marnie, I'm sorry for how I've been. It's just the thought of going back to the island." "I know," she said, "but you're here for a while yet, so we can cross that bridge when we come to it." "Marnie, where are you staying?" he asked, ashamed that he had not asked before. "In one of the boarding houses. They were grateful for the business with all the herring lassies away for Christmas." "Do you need money?" Marnie shuffled in her seat. "No," she said, her face pink. "Where do you get the money for the room, Marnie?" The pause that followed caused Jimmy to consider a raft of horrendous ways she might come by the money, and he looked at her, willing her to put his mind at rest. "Bill," she said. "What about Bill?" "Bill gave me the money." Marnie explained Bill's grief at sending Clara away, how he had descended into self-loathing that only eased with the birth of his son, Benjamin. "Benjamin's a darling bairn," she added, smiling. "He sent Clara away?" "Aye. I didna think he was right in the head after Anna's passing. He rushed to marry Rachel, as you know. In his own way, he was trying to do the best for all of them. He regretted it as soon as she left. Things are calmer there since Benjamin came along. It's not a conventional marriage, and I can't see them having more bairns, but they rub along together fine." Jimmy's mind raced with questions he needed answers to, but knew where he must start. "What happened to Clara? How did she end up here?" Marnie noticed the longing in Jimmy's eyes, and sadness crossed her beautiful face. "I don't know, Jimmy. Bill sent her to her grandparents in North Shields. They sent word that she had left, but no one knew where she went." "Hang on, did you say she's here? In Lowestoft?" "Aye," said Jimmy, and lay back on the bed. Why had she not written to him? Couldn't she trust him with her plans? How could she be happy away from her beloved island? He would have to wait for more answers, for at that moment the nurses wheeled an elderly gentleman into the ward and began transferring him to the bed beside Jimmy's. The man was grey, and Marnie took this as her cue to leave. "I'll come back tomorrow. We can talk more then," she said, leaning down to kiss his head. "Aye." As she walked away, he added, "Don't forget the paper and pencil." Marnie nodded and waved. Jimmy turned back to his book, but found it didn't grip him as it had before. His mind was full of worry for Clara. If only he had waited longer, they could have left together. He could have protected her. If only he had spoken to her at the dance. "Damn it," he said to himself. The grey man beside him groaned. Jimmy looked across. He had a neat moustache, cropped grey hair, and his hands were clean and smooth, not the hands of a man that worked the boats. Beneath the grey tinge, his skin was pale, and not the burnt brown of most of the town. Jimmy sighed, turned away, and tried to lose himself once more in his book. Chapter 46. December 1913. Over the next week, Marnie visited Jimmy daily, bringing a notebook with her and sitting on the edge of the hospital bed as Jimmy taught her the alphabet. She was a quick learner, and within a few days they had moved on to simple words. "I can see you've been practicing," he said, impressed. Marnie brushed off the praise with, "Aye, well, I've not much else to do." But still, she flushed with pride. They sat and talked some more. Marnie painting a picture of life with Bill and Rachel, the light that baby Benjamin had brought into the home. "He's not the Bill you knew, but his old self is returning. His eyes are still sad, mind, and he rushes to the window each time he hears horses' hooves, hopeful that Clara has returned." "Can they manage without you there to help?" "Oh, aye. I always considered Rachel a bit of a mouse, but she's fair bonny as a mam. Now Bill is more himself, she acts more comfortable, and they've grown fond of one another. It's no great love story, but she pours all her love into little Ben, and he shares it round the rest of us." "How's Mam? And Da?" "Same," said Marnie, not meeting Jimmy's eye, and twisting her hands together. "Sally and Robert are becoming more like them each day." Jimmy stared out of the window. Not enough had changed for him to return. Jimmy stole a glance across at his neighbour. The old man seemed to be improving. His colour was returning, and he had extended periods where he was awake. Jimmy tried to catch his eye, but the man stared at the ceiling. He had no visitors, and Jimmy felt lucky to have Marnie with him. There were moments when he couldn't believe she was there. He'd always planned to send for her, but not like this. Visiting hours ended, and they packed up the notebook for the day. Jimmy glanced across and saw the old man staring. "Hello," Jimmy said, but the man turned his head and resumed studying the ceiling. Marnie gave Jimmy a smirk and said goodbye. Jimmy picked up another book. "What's that you're reading, boy?" said a husky voice. Jimmy snapped his head round. The old man stared at the ceiling, but Jimmy was sure the words had come from him. "Pardon? Are you deaf, boy? I asked what you are reading." "Sorry, sir. It is a copy of Great Expectations, written by Charles Dickens." "I know who wrote it, boy," said the man. "What is your opinion of Magwitch?" Startled, Jimmy hesitated, then grew in confidence, relishing the chance to discuss Dickens with a fellow enthusiast. They only stopped talking when a stern nurse hushed them. She left the room, and the old man turned back to Jimmy. The literary discussion had enlivened him. His cheeks had grown pink. "Raymond Edwards, pleased to meet you." Unable to reach far enough for a handshake, Raymond raised a hand in a salute. Jimmy introduced himself and returned the gesture. "What is your profession, boy?" "I'm a fisherman, sir." "Huh? Is that so? Then tell me, where did a fisherman learn to read and converse like that?" "I had an excellent teacher," smiled Jimmy, thinking of Mrs. McKinnon and wondering if she was still at the island school. Another silence followed before Jimmy summoned the courage to find the answer to a question that had been teasing him. "I hope you don't mind me asking, sir, but what is your profession?" The old man's chest puffed out a little, and he answered with pride. "I am a headmaster. I have given 35 years' service to my profession, and I don't intend to stop now, even if my old ticker has other ideas. Do you enjoy fishing?" Jimmy laughed. "Aye, I do. Which is just as well as where I come from. There's not much choice about it. And do you intend to fish all your life? Jimmy lay mulling over Raymond's question. He wasn't sure his broken body would ever mend, never mind getting him back on the water. Demanded the man, unimpressed that Jimmy had ignored him. Sorry, sir. I suppose the answer to your question is that I don't know. I'd assumed there was little choice in the matter, but it seems fate has intervened. The doc tells me my leg may never heal, and I'm not much use to any crew without 2 working legs. The old man gave a small humph and resumed his inspection of the ceiling. Sensing the conversation was over, Jimmy lay back and retreated into his thoughts. What would he do? Even if his leg healed, it would not be in time for the next season. His arm was healing well, and his chest no longer felt crushed each time he breathed. The bruises on his face were barely visible, other than a faint yellow tinge. Yet his leg proved stubborn to mend. The nurses gave him crutches, and he could shuffle along a few paces, using his good leg to bear his weight, dragging his other behind. It was a long way from working, though. He thought of his time with Graham and the lads, and his dreams of joining them on a brand new steam drifter. They had become a surrogate family, and he would miss them. If Marnie took him back to the island, he would be beholden to others for his survival. The harsh working life of the north was no place for a cripple. That night, Jimmy dreamed of the island. He was running along the north shore, racing Clara through the shallow waters that licked the sand below. He was strong and fast, sprinting ahead of her, turning breathless and kicking jewels of salt water up in the air as she tried to catch him. As she reached him, he spread his arms, and she tumbled into them, clasping onto him to catch her breath. He lifted her high and spun her round and round, the toes of her boots catching the water, sending a rainbow of spray towards the sky. When he woke, he was still laughing, and the pain in his leg made him wonder if he had run across the firm sand rather than just dreamed it. Marnie walked into the ward and saw Jimmy smiling. "What's tickled your fancy this morning, then?" she asked. "I dreamed I had 2 working legs," he said. She seemed both satisfied and saddened by his answer. Setting down her cloth bag, she looked at him. "Jimmy, I don't want you worrying. I'll take good care of you once you're back home." Jimmy looked down and studied his hands. "The problem is, Marnie, the island isn't my home." Marnie sat on the bed and sighed. "I know, but I can't think what else we can do." He took her hands in his and reassured her he would be fine whatever happened and that she mustn't worry. He reached over to her bag and pulled out the notebook in a successful attempt at changing the conversation. After Marnie had left, Raymond eased himself out of bed and shuffled over to Jimmy, a piece of paper in his hand. He motioned to the chair beside Jimmy's bed. "May I?" Jimmy nodded, and Raymond sat down. "I know you can read, my boy, but can you also write?" Jimmy laughed. "I can, sir." "Good. Then I wonder if you can help me. I need to write to my sister, but my hands are shaky these days. Would you mind?" "Not at all." Jimmy took the pen and paper from Raymond and leant them against a book. "Fire away." Raymond dictated a letter that was so dull, Jimmy thought Raymond must hate his poor sister. On finishing, Jimmy handed back the paper and Raymond signed it with a flourish. "That all right?" "Yes," said Raymond, looking up. "Very good. Thank you, Jimmy." And with that, he stood up and shuffled his way back to bed. 2 days later, when Jimmy woke, Raymond's cubicle had its curtains drawn. Jimmy worried the old man's heart had given up the ghost. It was with surprise and relief that Jimmy saw the curtain open and Raymond step out dressed in a fine suit. Jimmy whistled. "Very smart." Raymond walked the few paces to Jimmy's bed and sat down beside it. "I am being allowed home today," he said with a smile. Jimmy smiled back, but felt a stab of sadness that he was losing his companion. There was no word yet when he would be ready to leave. "Jimmy, I have a proposition for you," said Raymond. "First, I must admit that I have lied.
I don't have a sister. I have a brother, Alfred.
Oh?
The letter was a test.
A test?
Yes, it was backhanded of me, I know, but I needed to check your writing to be sure.
The conversation was becoming stranger and stranger.
Sure of what? Your ability. I've been watching you, Jimmy, teaching your young lady to write.
My sister, Jimmy interrupted, but Raymond waved his hand to show the woman's identity was of no consequence.
I've been watching you teach your sister to read and write. I know you have excellent taste in reading matter and can discuss a text as well as any university graduate. I had to check if you could write. Now I know you can.
Thank you, sir. But why do you need to know those things?
Because I want you to teach,
Raymond said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. This revelation stunned Jimmy into silence.
Sir, that's very kind of you to say. But I don't have the means to attend a training college. Besides, I'm not sure they would even let me in given my dodgy leg.
Raymond laughed. It was a strange sound, high-pitched, like a young girl's giggle.
It's your mind we need, boy. You could have one eye and 3 arms for all I care, and I'm not talking about going to some fancy college. I'm talking about coming to work for me.
Jimmy's mouth fell open.
Is that allowed? I mean, can anyone become a teacher? Just like that? Of course not, said Raymond.
He stroked his moustache.
I will have to present your case to the board, and I will offer to tutor you. You would not be on a full salary until you complete your training. It is an unconventional route, yes, but not unheard of.
I don't know what to say, said Jimmy.
You must mull over my suggestion. How about I come and visit you next week, and we can talk it over some more? I could provide you with room and board in my school accommodation. Think it over, boy.
Jimmy nodded, and Raymond stood up.
One thing, Jimmy. You will need to work on that accent of yours. We teach my pupils in the King's English.
He said the last words with a flourish to emphasise his point, shook Jimmy's hand, and left. When Marnie came to visit, she found Jimmy staring out of the window, face frozen by some hidden emotion.
What's the matter, Jimmy?
Jimmy turned, and it shocked her to see tears rolling down his cheeks, spilling into his smiling mouth.
Marnie,
he said, eyes shining.
How would you like to stay in Lowestoft?
Chapter 47. December 1913. Raymond was true to his word. A week later he appeared on the ward, waving across at Jimmy. His usual shuffle had quickened, and he looked jolly as he crossed the room to Jimmy's bedside. As soon as he sat down, he opened his mouth to speak, then paused.
How are you? I apologise, I was going to launch right in there, but realised I haven't asked for your verdict on my proposition.
Jimmy smiled.
Sir, if you are prepared to train up a crippled island boy like me, then I would be quite the fool to refuse.
Raymond smiled, and it surprised Jimmy to notice a line of strong white teeth.
Good, good. I can see you have already been working on that dreadful accent of yours. I have been listening to the doc when he comes on his rounds. Unfortunately, my King's English is mostly medical terms, but at least it's a start.
Raymond giggled.
I am pleased you said yes, Jimmy, for I spoke to the board and the local authority, and both will accept you into the school under my tutelage.
Thank you, sir. Jimmy paused.
Sir, I do not wish to push my luck, but is there any chance my sister could stay with me for a while at least? The doc says it won't be long till I'm out of here, but I'm going to need a bit of help till I'm back on my feet, or foot, as it may well be.
Humph, Raymond said, pulling at the ends of his moustache.
The problem is, I only have one room, and I wouldn't expect the 2 of you to share.
Jimmy let out a loud guffaw that startled Raymond. Sir, we grew up sharing one room between the 12 of us. I think we can manage.
Oh, I see. Well, in that case, it won't be a problem. Would your sister help with the household chores? My regular Lady June is getting rather elderly. I'm sure she would be glad of the help.
Marnie arrived and Jimmy beckoned her over.
Let's ask her, said Jimmy.
It was an unlikely trio that sat in Jimmy's hospital bay, discussing the future. Marnie was delighted with the arrangement. She had kept details scant when talking to Jimmy of the island. The situation between Bill and Rachel was improving, but Alex was growing worse by the day. With Robert taking up the drink too, she had wondered how Jimmy would survive their cottage, unable to defend himself against the aggression that swirled through the home.
Sir, I would be most grateful to stay in Lowestoft and help both you and Jimmy. That is good to hear, young lady, but you won't be staying in Lowestoft. The school is in Somerleyton. Don't fret, it is only a few miles away, and I am sure you will like it.
They sat talking until Matron came to inform them visiting hours were over.
It is only 2 days until Christmas, said Marnie as they stood to leave. That means it's 6 weeks I've been in this bed, groaned Jimmy.
Marnie and Raymond agreed to visit Jimmy on Christmas morning, and it was a merry party that dispersed that evening. On Christmas morning, the little group reassembled by Jimmy's bedside. Marjorie had provided Jimmy with some paper for wrapping, and he presented both Marnie and Raymond with a book each from his collection. They handed their gifts to him. After opening 2 more books, Raymond handed them small wrapped packages.
Open them,
he said, twirling his moustache. Inside each package was a key.
Is this?
Yes, said Raymond.
As soon as you can leave, these are the keys to my home. I think it would be inappropriate for Marnie to arrive before you, so it's best you both wait until you are well enough, Jimmy.
Yes, said Jimmy, remembering his King's English.
Thank you, said Marnie, touched by his thoughtfulness.
The nurses brought a gramophone into the ward, and everyone was in good spirits. Matron swayed in time to the music, and Jimmy smiled in amusement. The 3 chatted for some time before visiting hours ended, and Marnie and Raymond stood up to leave.
Thank you both for coming. I'm sure you had better things to do today than sitting in a hospital ward you've just escaped from, Jimmy said. Oh, no, boy. If I wasn't here, I would be alone. My parents died long ago, and my brother is overseas. This has been the happiest Christmas I have had in quite some time.
Chapter 48. March 1914. It was 2 more months before Jimmy was well enough to leave the hospital. Marnie and Raymond visited regularly, but he was itching to escape the hospital's confines and begin his new life. Seeing no sense in waiting, Raymond started Jimmy's training in the hospital ward. He talked through the curriculum and left documents for Jimmy to peruse during the hours devoid of visitors. The nurses complained about the growing pile of papers beside Jimmy's bed, but even Matron seemed impressed by his new career. Marnie had worked through the money Bill gave her and found a job at a department store in town. It relieved Jimmy that she was taking to her new life well and relishing her financial independence. The only drawback to her job was how much it dominated their conversation. He had no interest in women's clothing or household goods and had to feign enthusiasm as she droned on about the disastrous love lives of her colleagues. Marnie ignored Jimmy's disinterest, for her new life thrilled her, and Jimmy was a good sounding board. Jimmy's body grew stronger, and he could walk beyond the ward with the aid of a stick. On the eve of his departure, the nurses gathered with Marnie and Raymond for an impromptu leaving party. They turned a blind eye as Raymond slipped a dram of whiskey into Jimmy's glass.
To Jimmy, toasted Marjorie. Here's hoping we never meet again. To Jimmy!
Jimmy wouldn't miss the hospital, but would miss the nurses who had kept him sane these past months. On his last night in the ward, Jimmy couldn't sleep. If he were honest, the thought of his new career terrified him. Raymond had been so kind. Jimmy wanted to honour that kindness with competence and skill, but felt he possessed neither. Jimmy was tucking in his shirt when Marnie arrived the following morning.
Come on, she said, linking arms. Raymond's waiting outside.
Jimmy followed her out of the ward to the applause of the nurses. Raymond sat waiting in a carriage and jumped down to take Jimmy's bag.
"Lowestoft Station," he said to the driver.
Tilting his head up to the sun, Jimmy swallowed big gulps of salty air. Despite the season ending, the smell of herring lingered and filled him with nostalgia for his time on the Stargazer. His friends would all be in the warmth of their homes and families by now. He wondered if he would see them again. Lowestoft Station was quiet, and the train to Somerleyton quieter still. It was an effort to climb the train steps, but Jimmy insisted on conquering them alone. The train passed by flat fields and marshy wetlands, but was soon pulling into the station.
"We'll get a cart to the schoolhouse," said Raymond. "If it's all right with you, I'd like to walk."
Marnie and Raymond exchanged worried glances.
"It's a good mile's walk, dear boy. Might be best to rest that leg of yours."
"It'll be fine," said Jimmy. Knowing there was no point in arguing, the trio began the slow walk to the village. They passed by farms and fields, and reaching a large common, Jimmy paused and leant against a gate.
"Everything all right, dear boy?"
"Yes, I just need to rest my leg for a moment." Marnie and Raymond remained quiet. It was plain to both that Jimmy was struggling, his face twisting in pain with every step.
"Right, let's carry on,"
Jimmy said, and they followed, ready to catch him if his leg gave way. They passed the brickworks and a line of workers' cottages. By the time they reached the centre of the village, Jimmy was sweating.
"What's behind there?"
he asked, pointing to a high red brick wall with his stick. The wall snaked along for miles.
"Oh, that's the hall," said Raymond. "You'll get to visit it soon enough."
Turning a corner, they came upon a large green, picture postcard houses snuggled around its borders.
"Blimey, this is posh,"
Raymond giggled.
"I suppose it is."
The sparrow's nest above the grit had a thatched roof, but this was the first time either of the siblings had seen thatch on the homes of ordinary folk.
"You see that building over there?"
asked Raymond, pointing across the green.
"That's the school."
A fine white building with a thatched roof dominated the green.
"The best view is from the other side," he said,
leading them on. Jimmy and Marnie gasped as they rounded the corner to the school. Two low buildings flanked a beautiful octagonal structure, topped with the same thatch. Raymond smiled at their reaction.
"I wish I had a photographer to capture your faces," he said. "Come on, let's get you settled in."
He led them through a red-painted gate into a small entrance lobby where coats, boots, hats and walking sticks adorned the walls. The first thing they noticed, stepping into the main room, was the light. It flooded in from windows on all sides, forming diamonds as it skirted the window's lead.
"Come upstairs and I'll show you your room."
The treads of the staircase, though well polished, bore the scuffs of years of footsteps. Above them, the building split into 2 rooms.
"That's my room there," pointed Raymond. "And this," he said, pushing open a door, "is yours."
There was nothing grand about the room. It contained only 2 thin beds, an armchair and a chest of drawers. But Jimmy thought it was perfect. Against one wall stood a simple fireplace, and Jimmy was sure they would be cosy on winter nights. Marnie rushed to the window and marvelled at the view outside.
"Look, Jimmy, from this side you can see the green, and from the other you can see miles of fields. I love it."
Jimmy walked over to his sister and placed an arm across her shoulder.
"I do too," he said.
That evening, as they sat by the fire in Raymond's sitting room, he gave Jimmy some advice.
"The key is not to show any weakness. The pupils will assume you have been teaching for years. Don't give them reason to doubt it. Pretend you're an actor on a stage. Fool them into thinking you're in control. And, whatever you do, don't forget your King's English."
Jimmy nodded, but the advice filled him with nerves. Facing a room of young children felt far more intimidating than facing a storm at sea. He slept badly, tossing and turning as he played potential scenarios through his mind.
"You'll be fine,"
murmured Marnie, woken again by Jimmy's restlessness. Jimmy sighed and waited for the morning to come. He woke with the dawn, finding Marnie already up and preparing for her own day's work.
"What time is your train?"
"8. I'm pleased you found a job near a station," she said, smiling. Too nervous for breakfast, Jimmy was in the schoolroom an hour early, reading over and over his notes, checking his chalk was to hand, and when he could prepare no more, pacing the room. At last the bell went and children filed in. They gazed at him in curiosity, and Jimmy took a deep breath. He took the register in the sternest voice he could muster, and the children remained compliant. He was harsher than he would have liked, sending 2 children to the corner with the dunce's hat and rapping his cane loudly on the tables of those not listening. The new-found fierceness didn't sit well with him, but he couldn't risk losing control. Time flew by, and before he knew it, the dinner bell rang. The children came from families of either estate workers or brickmakers, and all ran from the school to their nearby homes. The afternoon went by in much the same way as the morning. As the first afternoon lesson was drawing to a close, he noticed 2 boys nudging each other.
"Stand up, boy,"
said Jimmy, rapping his cane against his palm.
"What is all the commotion about?"
"It's his fault," cried the boy, pointing to his friend at the desk beside him. "He wanted me to ask about your leg." Jimmy knew he should scold their insolence, but curiosity got the better of him.
"What about my leg?"
Well, we was wondering what happened to it." Jimmy crossed the room. He leant over the boy and saw that the young lad was shaking, his voice only audible to the child in front of him. He lied.
"A crocodile attack."
The boy gasped, and Jimmy winked to show he was joking, but the boy's eyes almost popped out of his skull. At break, boys huddled together, and Jimmy could guess their conversation by the furtive glances they kept stealing his way. Raymond appeared in the final half-hour of lessons to check Jimmy was all right. Jimmy was grateful that Raymond had left him alone without scrutiny to settle in. Raymond was both surprised and impressed by the respect the children showed Jimmy, but couldn't understand why they kept eyeing his leg. Jimmy didn't admit his tall tale to Raymond, but told Marnie when they were in bed that night. She was delighted his first day had gone well, and impressed by his use of a white lie to win his charges round. She looked across at her brother. "He's found his way home," she thought.
Lowestoft.
Chapter 49. October 1913. There was a fair nip in the air as the girls strode through Lowestoft. They hurried to the harbour and searched among boats for men they knew. It struck Clara that Kitty knew everyone. "Kitty!" men yelled, waving from boats and blowing kisses her way. Some she answered with a kiss in return, others with a hand gesture that made Clara splutter with mirth. Cassie was no less popular, attracting wolf whistles from young hopefuls as she leant against the harbour wall. Heather had left them to it, searching out her husband to warn him against getting up to no good. Financial independence brought confidence, and the girls held their own among men. But Clara, knowing no one, hung back. Many of the conversations were in Gaelic or Scots, and she would have thought them arguments, but for the smiles on faces. Were it not for her training on the island, her friends' crudeness might have shocked. Their grasp of English swear words was second to none. Conversations chattered on, comparing notes on voyages and sharing news from back home. It was growing dark by the time they left. Clara had lost all sensation in her hands and could not stop shivering. She was used to the cold, but the easterly winds blew right through her, and she made a mental note to put on more layers the next time she went out. Her bed was cooling. The company, however delightful, proved exhausting after so many months on her own. Back in the dorm, Clara struggled to sleep. Every time her body edged towards slumber, her mind chased sleep away. Too much had happened for her mind to still, and she gave in to its wanderings, listening to the gentle snores, and worse, from the bunk above, as she thought back over the day's events. She must have got just 2 hours' sleep, for before dawn had broken, the small dormitory came to life. The girls trudged out to the privy for their morning ablutions before readying themselves for a day's work. They pulled on thick sweaters, rolled up at the sleeves, twisted their hair into scarves, and bound their fingers in cotton cloots. Arms linked, they headed down to the pickling yard, where they put on oilskin aprons and boots. Kitty made Clara give them a twirl. "Look, girls, she's one of us!" Dawn was breaking, and with no sign of any fish, they settled themselves down on empty swills and pulled out their knitting. Despite the early hour and threatening easterly sky, spirits were high, and anticipation rippled through their group as they waited for silver darlings to arrive. Carts carrying containers loaded with herring pulled into the yard. The women took up their positions at the farlin. Clara, Kitty and Cassie stood together as a crew. Kitty the packer was their leader by default. Shoulder to shoulder with other crews, the line of women filled the length of the yard. Soon, silvery fish came tumbling from their containers into the trough, piling high in a mass of silver scales and bleak eyes. Clara gripped her small knife. Fish in hand, she cut a neat incision into its throat before pulling its gills and intestines through with a light slurp and throwing it into a tub. She was soon in her stride, flying through the fish almost as fast as they flew through water. "Alice taught you well," Kitty called. Clara smiled but didn't take her eyes off her knife. After 3 months of being idle, it took only a few hours to feel the effects of work on her body. Her back ached from bending over the farlin, and despite the cloots on her fingers, she gained several grazes as her knife slipped. She refused to lose pace, pushing through the pain and gritting her teeth. The surrounding atmosphere helped. Songs rang out across the yard, and thanks to the long train journey, she knew the words. The long line of girls joined in song, time passing with each note sung. As I were walking down by the seaside, I saw a red herring washed up by the tide, and that little herring I took home and dried. Don't you think I'd done well with my jolly herring? Too-a-la-la-dee-ri, too-a-la-lay, too-a-la-la-dee-ri, too-a-la-lay, too-a-la-la-dee-ri, co-a-la-lay. Don't you think I'd done well with my jolly herring? Now what would you think that I made with his eyes? The finest of lamps now that ever did shine. There were big lamps and little lamps and lamps for to shine. Don't you think I'd done well with my jolly herring? Now what would you think that I made of his head? The finest of ovens that ever baked bread. There was big ovens and little ovens and ovens to bake. Don't you think I'd done well with my jolly herring? Now what would you think that I made of his gills? The finest of boats now that ever did sail. There was big boats and little boats and boats for to sail. Don't you think I'd done well with my jolly herring? Now what would you think that I made of his back? Just as much money I could pack in a sack. There were sixpences, shillings and crowns by the score. Don't you think I'd done well with my jolly herring? It was a grey morning, but amidst the frenzied work, the spits of drizzle were negligible. Not once did they see the bottom of the wooden farlin, for each time they got close, someone would arrive with more fish, a waterfall of bodies piling up in the trough once again. Slice, thud, the work became hypnotic. The call came for lunch, and the girls downed tools. Heather helped Clara rinse her wounds free of salt and bandaged fresh cloots around them. With several girls needing the first aid station, Clara was fortunate she had only minor grazes. Kitty came round with herring and bread, and quiet descended as the girls devoured their meal. With plates cleared, some girls wandered off to chat to the lads at the dock. Clara suspected Kitty and Cassie might have joined them, but sensing their friends' exhaustion, they remained in the yard, taking up their knitting in solidarity. The crew looked up at the sky. Dark clouds were rushing through the grey, and it didn't bode well for their afternoon. The rain came at 2 and lasted till 5. Despite the short-sleeved oilskins, rain was soon dripping from the hoods, rushing down the smooth surface and finding its way into layers of sweaters below. Standing in a muddle of fish guts and rainwater several inches deep, Clara wondered what Phyllis would think if she could see her now. Water streamed in rivers down her oilskin apron, collecting in puddles on her boots. Still, the girls remained cheerful, Heather proving quite the storyteller as she led her workmates through the exploits of her youth. It was a good day for the boats and boded well for the remaining season. As dusk fell, there was no sign of the work letting up. By now, Clara was dead on her feet, fish melting before her as her eyes lost focus. Their cooper, Richard, came out to seal the barrels. He took the girls' teasing in good spirits, responding to their jibes with a quick wit. He laid down some naphtha flares for the girls to work by. In the light of the flares, fish glowed silver, like mystical creatures from the depths. Clara's black apron glistened with scales, and she looked like a most strange breed of fairy. 30 barrels! Cried Kitty as the day drew to a close. Is that good? Aye, said Kitty, drawing Clara into a tight embrace. It's grand, Clara. Grand. Clara smiled. The walk home was arduous, every muscle in her body screaming in rebellion. She dragged herself into bed, falling asleep in seconds. Chapter 50. November 1913. Clara was dog-tired. She sat on the floor of the dorm, back against the wall, head nodding as sleep came in waves. Kitty jumped from her bed. Come on, we're going out. No, begged Clara, weariness pinning her to the floor. Kitty grabbed her hand and hauled her up to standing. She placed her hands on Clara's shoulders and shook her. You're a young lass. Stop acting like an old woman. Clara smiled and yawned. No excuses, said Kitty, and flung a clean dress at Clara. As she dressed, Clara hated Kitty for keeping her from her bed. Her body had grown used to the work as weeks passed, but tiredness remained a stubborn companion. But there was no point arguing with Kitty when an idea came into her head. Clara ran a brush through her long auburn hair, but made no more effort to be presentable. She intended to slip out from the dance and head home the first chance she got. The cool night air refreshed her, the mist of sleep receding from her mind. They entered a hall filled with music and chatter. Couples were dancing, and groups of men and women huddled together, sharing jokes and sizing up their counterparts. Kitty ordered 2 gins, and they moved through the hall, searching for familiar faces among the crowd. The music revived Clara's soul, and she joined in the fun, laughing as lads came over to try their luck with her friends. A young man had been loitering beside them for a while before they noticed him. Can we help you? Asked Kitty, turning from Clara and staring hard at the young man. I was wondering if your friend would like to dance. Clara looked at the man. His face was childlike and his features nondescript. What struck Clara was his eyes. In colour, they were a watery blue, the blue of a winter sea rather than a summer sky, but they were kind. Aye, I'll dance with you, she said, handing her drink to Kitty. Kitty seemed taken aback by Clara's impulsiveness. Her eyes twinkled as she watched Clara melt into the pulsating sea of bodies. It must have been the gin, thought Clara, surprised at her readiness to enter this man's arms. The band was playing a lively tune, and the man held her close, spinning around until dizzy. Her dance partner tried to say something, but Clara couldn't hear above the noise coming from the musicians. Pardon, she shouted, moving her head nearer his ear. I'm Michael, he shouted back. Oh, I'm Clara. Pleased to meet you. They danced a while longer before Michael moved his mouth close to her ear. Can we get some fresh air? It's hot in here. Clara would not normally have allowed herself to be alone at night with a young man, but something about Michael left her reassured. She followed him out into the darkness. Her instincts proved trustworthy as he showed her to a nearby bench and sat a respectable distance away. Thank you, he said with a wide smile. I thought I might melt into a puddle if I stayed in there much longer. Clara smiled.
Thank you for the dance. You're light on your feet, and my toes are still intact.
Where are you from?
Holy Island, up in the north.
Oh, I've met a few lads from there before and seen it on a map. You're a long way from home. What brought you down south?
Reluctant to spill her heart to a stranger. The Silver Darlings, was all she said, and he seemed satisfied with her answer. They talked a while longer, before tiredness returned, and Clara stifled a yawn.
You're tired. Let me walk you back to your lodgings.
Aye, thank you. At her front door, Michael seemed nervous.
I'd like to see you again, if that would be agreeable.
He looked at her like a child at an ice cream stand. Clara smiled. Aye, she said. I would like that too.
How about Sunday? 11ish?
Clara nodded and let herself into the house, waving at Michael as she closed the door. She had enjoyed his company, but as she fell asleep, it was Jimmy who occupied her dreams. At 11:15 on Sunday morning, Clara looked out of her small window and saw Michael pacing the street below. She tapped on the glass and he looked up, startled. She waved, smiled and raised her hand to show she would be down in 5 minutes. Her roommates were lounging on their beds and ribbed her as she smoothed down her hair and straightened her jacket.
Someone's getting lucky tonight, Clara glared.
What's he like?
He's kind.
Is he a good kisser? Asked Heather, and the other girls laughed. We haven't kissed yet. He's a gentleman, said Clara with a haughty flick of her head.
Yet,
squealed Kitty, wrapping her arms around herself and making kissing noises at her friend. Stop it! I'm off for a walk, not a wedding. As Clara left the room, the echoes of giggles faded behind her.
Hello,
said Michael as she appeared from the house.
Hello.
It took a while for conversation to move beyond pleasantries. Walking calmed them both, and they spent a pleasant morning strolling along the fine pale sand of Lowestoft Beach. Michael spoke of his life growing up in the town and how much it had changed with the herring industry. He spoke with warmth about his family, and Clara hoped one day she might meet them. For the first time in months, she spoke of her mam and the island with happiness, the lump of grief that sat within her dislodging from its resting place. They walked along the promenade, enjoying the brief respite of a Sunday. All work paused, and the drifters tucked in harbour for the day. Michael showed her to his boat, the Elizabeth.
My brother Joe named her after Ma, he explained.
Impressed by the steam trawler, Clara admired its funnel, the height of technology. Michael seemed pleased.
It's Joe's boat. I'm only third mate, but he's a good skipper and great to work for. One day I hope to have a boat of my own.
As they neared Clara's lodgings, Michael paused and looked at her, frowning.
Please tell me if I'm being presumptuous, but would you like to meet my family? We gather on a Sunday for afternoon tea, and they are always welcoming of my friends.
His feet shuffled as he spoke.
Oh, so you bring female friends home to tea every weekend? Do you?
Michael flushed and looked crestfallen.
No, I...
Clara reached out and placed a hand on his arm. Michael, I'm teasing. I would love to meet your family. She linked her arm in his, motioning for him to lead the way. Michael showed her to a small terraced house. It was narrower than any house Clara had seen, but hanging beside the front door were 2 baskets, ivy spilling from them. The front door was a cheerful red, and net curtains drooped like smiles in the windows.
I'm back,
Michael called to the waiting family. The front door opened straight into a small room stuffed with old armchairs, their pink flowers worn on the arms and headrests. A table sat in the middle of the room, well polished and housing a jug of flowers. Clara smiled. The room reminded her of her mam. There was a gentle homeliness to it she hadn't felt for some time. In the kitchen beyond, a small wooden dining table was the scene of lively conversation. Its occupants looked up, surprised, as Clara followed Michael into the room.
Ma, this is my friend Clara.
I've asked her to join us for tea, if that's all right."
An elderly woman with a wide smile moved from her chair and rushed to Clara. "It is," she said, pulling Clara into a warm embrace that left her startled.
"Lovely to meet you, dear. Here, have a seat."
She offered her own chair, which Clara took out of politeness. Michael introduced Clara to the smiling faces around the table.
"This is my dad, Ted, brother Joe, his wife Susan, and of course my mum, Betty."
He put an arm around his mother, kissing her cheek. The family said their hellos. Betty leapt into a flurry of activity, bringing out plate after plate of scones and jam, tea cakes, sandwiches, and a large Victoria sponge. The chatter continued as the family ate. They asked Clara many questions and listened open-mouthed to her tales of childhood on an island. At one point, Betty placed a round, warm hand on Clara's, tears in her eyes.
"Your ma sounds wonderful, dear."
"Aye, she was."
Ted was so like Michael,
the only difference being his face housed a thin beard and his hair was greying. Susan was a slip of a woman, not over 5 feet tall, with golden hair and deep brown eyes. She had a ready smile and seemed pleased to have another female at the table. "How did you two meet?"
"At a dance," said Clara with a smile. "You're the first girl he's brought home," whispered Susan.
She winked, and Clara blushed.
"We only met last week."
"Looks like a whirlwind romance to me." Clara smiled, but the comment worried her. She liked Michael, but wondered if it was his welcoming family that attracted her more than the man himself.
"Would you like to come over for a cuppa next week?" Susan asked.
"I've not been out much since I fell pregnant."
"Oh, I didn't realise,"
said Clara, eyeing Susan's washboard stomach and wondering how any life could fit in there.
"I'd love to, but I might struggle to get away from the yard. Work's been frantic these past weeks."
"What are you two whispering about?"
asked Joe.
"Mind your own business," said Susan, folding her arms and grinning.
"Where are you staying, love?"
asked Ted.
"The Grit."
There's some wrong uns round there. You be careful walking them streets."
"Oh, I like it," said Clara.
"The townsfolk are snobby about us Gritsters," said Susan. "You're all right, just passing through. But me and Joe kept my address secret till we were sure Ted and Betty liked me."
"You grew up on the Grit?"
"Yep, loved every second. It was a hard life in lots of ways. No money, little food and such like, but as a child it was paradise. All summer long we'd be down the beach, swimming, building sandcastles and making pictures from the pebbles. Ma would pack us lard sandwiches and tell us not to be home till tea time," Susan laughed. "If we weren't on the beach, we were playing at the Deans, or messing around the boat sheds, or pickling plots. We had no money, no shoes or socks, but plenty of freedom." Clara smiled, thinking of her own childhood. The Grit reminded her of the island, a close-knit community cut off from those around them. The harshness of their existence resulted in both steeliness of its people and a strength of belonging that meant anyone would do anything for their neighbour.
"I'd love you to meet my family sometime. They live on Nelson Road, next to the church. You know it?"
"Aye, I think so. I know the church anyway. Maybe I can meet you there one evening after work."
"I'd love that," said Clara.
It was disappointing when tea was over, and Clara knew she must leave or outstay her welcome. She thanked the family, and Betty again embraced her. Michael said he'd walk her home, and she noticed Ted patting him on the back as they left the room. Clara was quiet as they walked, and a look of concern crossed Michael's face.
"I'm sorry, was that too forward? I shouldn't have introduced you to them so soon."
She stopped walking and smiled at him, looking into his kind eyes that were both hopeful and concerned.
"Michael, I had the most wonderful time. It felt like home."
And she blushed at her unintended candour. Michael grinned, and as they reached Clara's dorm, gave her a chaste kiss on the cheek.
"Would you like to come again next Sunday?"
I would."
Chapter 51. November 1913. The next 3 Sundays, Michael picked Clara up on the dot of 11, and they repeated their walk and Sunday tea. Clara found no time to visit Susan or her family, but talking with Michael's sister-in-law was a highlight of her weekends. A slight bump showed on Susan's stomach, and Clara shared her excitement at the growing life within it. "Have you thought of names for the bairn?" Susan smiled, enjoying the sing-song nature of Clara's accent. "Lizzie if it's a girl, Edward if it's a boy. Joe wants to name them after his parents, and thankfully they both have pretty names. I can't wait for him or her to arrive and meet you." Clara didn't voice her thoughts to Susan that she would be long gone by the time the bairn arrived. "Fancy meeting my family this week?" "Susan, I'd love to, but I can never seem to get away from work in time." "Well, do you think Michael would mind if I walked you home tonight? We could call in on my ma on the way to yours." "I'm sure he can cope for 1 week. Are you all right walking around there after dark?" "Oh, not you as well," said Susan. "I'm a gritster. They look after their own. I'll be perfectly safe." "It sounds like a wonderful idea then," said Clara. After tea, the women said their goodbyes. Michael looked disappointed not to be walking her home, but Clara felt no guilt as she linked arms with Susan and waved goodbye. Susan led Clara through a maze of streets and alleyways. "This is Herring Fishery Score," said Susan, "and that's my old school." She pointed to a single-storey building near the bottom of the alley. "I remember little teaching from my school days, but I remember the toilets clear as day. Caw, they didn't half stink. 3 troughs flushed just 3 times a day. The boys were even worse. Theirs didn't flush at all, and in summer stale pea perfumed the entire building." Clara giggled, enjoying the impromptu tour. "How many people live in the Grit?" "Hard to say. A lot more this time of year. A couple of thousand would be my guess." "Phew, that makes my island seem tiddly." "How many's there?" "Couple of 100. There's more when the herring come, but nothing like this." "Did your school stink of pea?" Clara laughed. "Not that I remember." "Here we are," said Susan, standing outside a red-bricked cottage. "Got to do the special knock, or Ma will think it's the landlord after his rent." Susan tapped out a rhythmic pattern of knocking on the rough wooden door. "That you, Sue?" came a voice from behind the door. "Yes, Ma, let me in. It's freezing out here." Several locks turned, and a small, impish woman poked her head round the door. "Who's this?" "Clara, Michael's girl," said Susan. "Nice to meet you, Clara. Come on in. Don't mind the mess." Clara walked into a small sitting room, children filling every space on the floor. Susan went and kissed each in turn. "My siblings," she said. 6 girls, 7 boys. I'm the eldest." Susan met Clara's gasp with a grin. "Where do you all sleep?" "I'll show you. Follow me." Susan led Clara up a bare stairway. Above it lay 2 rooms. "That's for the boys. This is the girls," said Susan, pointing an arm at each. A musty smell hit Clara as Susan opened the door to the girls' room. It reminded her of walking past the barns of the island farm. Clara's feet sank into a soft layer of straw. She looked at Susan, open-mouthed. Susan laughed. "They treat us like animals here," she said with a grin. "Come on, lie down." Clara followed her friend's lead and lay down on the straw. Susan threw her a blanket. "Close your eyes," she said. Clara did as she was told, pulling the blanket around her and closing her eyes tight. "Makes sense now, don't it?" asked Susan. "Aye, it does." The straw made for a soft bed, and after a long week working in the yard, Clara would have happily stayed the night, assured of a good night's sleep. She sneezed. "Oh yes, that is one downside, I'll grant you. You get used to it though. And the smell. It's a very efficient system, really. We chuck the straw out of the window on a Friday ready for burning, then replace it with a fresh load. Saves on laundry. Took me a while to get used to a proper bed after I married Joe. Oh, don't you tell Betty about this. She'd be horrified." Clara giggled at the thought of Betty and Ted seeing their daughter-in-law's childhood bedroom. What are you girls doing up there? Come down for some tea, called Susan's ma. The girls headed back downstairs. Clara was a hit with the children, who asked her endless questions about the island. They reminded her of Jimmy's sisters, but despite the obvious hardship, the home contained none of the nastiness that came with Alex Watson.
Lovely to meet you, said Clara as the time came to leave. Call round any time, dear. You know where we are now. Aye, I will. Thank you.
Clara hugged Susan and watched as her friend made her way back through the dark streets of the Grit. On their 4th week of meetings, as Michael dropped her home, he blushed and asked,
Clara, would you mind if I kissed you?
Clara met his blush with her own.
I suppose not, she said,
and let him pull her closer. His lips were moist against hers, and as they moved, Clara waited for the thrill. But it never came.
Hope filled Michael's eyes, and she felt a rush of warmth for this kind young man.
She smiled at him and gave him one last peck on the lips.
See you next week.
Yes, please,
he said. In bed that night, Clara played the kiss over in her mind. Michael seemed happy with it, and she supposed no kiss could be as exciting as your first. A lump of guilt sat in her stomach, but she pushed it away. Jimmy had said he would write, but had broken his promise. She owed him nothing. He had left. Michael was here.